The stagecoach that brought Penelope Morrison to Fort Bowie, Arizona in the scorching summer of 1878, carried nothing but her battered carpetbag and the hollow ache of complete loss. And when she stepped down onto the dusty Main Street with the desert sun beating mercilessly on her black mourning dress, she had no idea that the desperate widower watching from across the road would become her entire world. Thomas Patrick stood outside the general store with flour dust on his work shirt and exhaustion carved into every line of his 32-year-old face, his arms full of supplies he could barely afford while his 6 children waited at home in various states of chaos. The oldest, 12-year-old Daniel, was probably trying to keep the younger ones from burning down the house or killing each other, and Thomas knew he should have been back an hour ago. But he had stopped moving when the stagecoach arrived, frozen by the sight of the young woman in widow's weeds who looked as lost as he felt. Penelope was 24 and had buried her husband of only 8 months in a cholera epidemic back in Missouri that had taken half their town and everything she owned except the clothes on her back and the $17 sewn into her hem. She had no family left, no prospects, and the address of a distant cousin in Fort Bowie who might or might not remember she existed. The heat was suffocating after the cooler climate she had left behind, and her corset felt like it was crushing her ribs as she looked around at the adobe buildings and the harsh landscape that seemed determined to kill anything soft or green. "You look like you could use some water, miss," a kind voice said, and Penelope turned to see an older woman with silver hair tucked under a bonnet standing in the doorway of what appeared to be a boarding house. "This heat is not forgiving to newcomers." "Thank you," Penelope managed, her throat dry as sandpaper. She followed the woman inside, grateful for the relative coolness of the thick adobe walls. The woman introduced herself as Martha Dawson, proprietor of the boarding house, and within minutes had Penelope seated with a glass of water and a plate of bread and cheese. "Who are you here to see?" Martha asked gently, her experienced eyes taking in the mourning dress and the too thin frame beneath it. "My cousin, Eleanor Whitfield," Penelope said. "She married a soldier stationed here about 5 years ago. I am hoping she might remember me and perhaps help me find work." Martha's face fell and Penelope's heart dropped like a stone. "Oh, my dear. Eleanor and her husband were transferred to Fort Apache 6 months ago. They are good people, sent me a letter when they arrived safely, but that is a 3-day ride from here in good conditions." The bread turned to dust in Penelope's mouth. She had spent her last money on the stagecoach ticket to Fort Bowie. She had nothing left for another journey, and even if she did, traveling alone through Apache territory was suicide for a woman on her own. "I see," she said quietly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Then I suppose I need to find employment here. Is there work available?" Martha hesitated. "The truth is, dear, there is not much for a lady like yourself. The laundry takes Chinese workers who will do it for almost nothing. The saloon girls, well, that is not for you. There is the school, but Miss Patterson has been the teacher for 15 years and shows no sign of leaving. Some of the officers' wives might need help with sewing or housework, but those positions are few and usually filled." Penelope nodded, swallowing hard against the panic rising in her throat. She could not fall apart. She had survived watching her husband die in 3 days of fever and delirium. She had survived selling everything she owned just to eat. She would survive this too, somehow. "I can take washing at my boarding house," Martha said kindly, "and you can stay here for a reduced rate if you help with the cooking and cleaning. It is not much, but it is something." "I would be grateful," Penelope said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. That evening, as Penelope lay in the small room under the eaves that Martha had given her, She listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town and wondered what on earth she was going to do. Back in Missouri, she had been a merchant's daughter with education and prospects. She had married Robert Morrison believing they would build a life together, have children, grow old in the community where she had been born. Instead, she had 8 months of happiness before disease stole everything, and now she was alone in a place so foreign it might as well have been another country. Across town, Thomas Patrick was having an equally difficult night. His wife Catherine had died 9 months ago in childbirth, taking their 7th child with her, and he had been drowning ever since. Daniel at 12 was doing his best, but he was still a child himself. Lucy was 10 and tried to mother the younger ones, but she dissolved into tears at least once a day from the pressure. The twins, Samuel and Sarah, were 8 and wild as coyotes, constantly fighting and breaking things. 5-year-old James was still having nightmares about his mother and wet the bed more nights than not. And little Emma, only 3 years old, kept asking when Mama was coming home, and every time she did it felt like a knife twisting in Thomas's chest. He worked at the mill during the day, barely making enough to keep them fed. At night, he came home to chaos, burned dinners or no dinner at all, fighting children, a house that was falling apart despite his best efforts. He was failing them, he knew it, and the weight of that failure was crushing him. "Papa, Emma will not stop crying," Lucy said, appearing in the doorway of the small bedroom he had once shared with Catherine. Her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. "I tried everything." Thomas dragged himself up, every muscle aching. He found Emma curled in the corner of the room she shared with Lucy, sobbing so hard she was hiccuping. He picked her up and she buried her face in his neck. "Want Mama," she whimpered. "Want Mama." "I know, sweetheart," he whispered, his own eyes burning. "I know." He rocked her until she finally cried herself to sleep, then laid her gently in her bed. When he returned to the main room, he found Daniel trying to clean up the remains of whatever dinner had been attempted. The pot was scorched black on the bottom. "I am sorry, Papa," Daniel said, not looking at him. "I tried to watch it, but Samuel and Sarah got into a fight and Sarah hit her head on the table and there was blood and I had to take care of that. Is she all right?" Thomas asked, alarm shooting through him. "Just a bump. I put a cold cloth on it like Mama used to." The casual mention of Catherine, the way Daniel said it like she might walk through the door any moment, made something crack in Thomas's chest. He pulled his oldest son into a hug, feeling how thin the boy had gotten, how much responsibility was sitting on shoulders too young to carry it. "You are doing your best," Thomas said. "We all are." But his best was not good enough and he knew it. The next day, Martha sent Penelope to the general store with a list of supplies needed for the boarding house. Penelope welcomed the errand, glad for something to do, and a chance to learn more about the town that was apparently going to be her home for the foreseeable future. The store was busy with soldiers from the nearby fort and townspeople stocking up on necessities. She was examining the prices on fabric, trying to calculate whether she could afford enough to make herself a dress that was not heavy black wool, when she heard a commotion near the front of the store. "I said I will pay you next week, Mr. Henderson," a man's voice said, strained and tired. "I just need you to extend my credit a bit longer." "Thomas, I have been extending your credit for months," another voice replied, not unkindly but firmly. "I have a business to run. I cannot keep giving away goods." "I am not asking you to give them away. I will pay. I just need a little more time." Penelope glanced over and saw the man from yesterday, the one who had been watching when she arrived. Up close, she could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked like he had not slept in weeks, and there was something desperate in the set of his jaw. "Papa, I am hungry," a small voice piped up, and Penelope saw a little girl clutching the man's hand, no more than 3 or 4, with tangled blonde curls and a dirty face. The man's expression crumpled for just a moment before he composed himself. "I know, Emma. We will have dinner soon, I promise." The storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, sighed heavily. "All right, Thomas, but this is the last time. You need to figure something out." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "Thank you." He gathered his meager purchases, took his daughter's hand, and turned to leave. As he did, his eyes met Penelope's, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. She saw her own exhaustion and desperation reflected back at her, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared suffering. Then he was gone, and Penelope turned back to her shopping with a strange ache in her chest. That evening, Martha was full of gossip about Thomas Patrick, which she shared while she and Penelope prepared dinner for the boarding house guests. 6 children and doing it all alone since his wife died, Martha said, shaking her head. Catherine was a good woman, God rest her soul, died bringing their 7th child into the world, and the baby did not survive either. Thomas has been barely holding on ever since. Works at the mill during the day, but what he makes is hardly enough to feed 6 growing children. The oldest boy has been trying to help, but he is only 12. It is a tragedy all around. Penelope's hand stilled on the vegetables she was chopping. 6 children. No wonder the man looked so exhausted. She tried to imagine managing 6 children alone and could not fathom it. "Does he have no family to help?" she asked. "None nearby. His parents are back east somewhere, and Catherine's family disowned her when she married Thomas. They thought he was beneath her, being a mill worker. Pride is a terrible thing." Martha sighed. "The church ladies tried to help at first, bringing meals and such, but you know how it is. People have their own lives and their own troubles. The help dried up after a few months." That night, Penelope lay awake thinking about the man with the storm-gray eyes and his 6 children. She thought about the little girl asking for food and the desperate look on his face. She knew what it was like to have nothing, to be drowning and see no way out. She had felt it every day since Robert died. The next morning, Martha asked Penelope to take a basket of eggs to trade with various townspeople for goods the boarding house needed. One of the stops was the mill, where Martha sometimes traded for lumber needed for repairs. Penelope's stomach fluttered nervously as she approached the large wooden building by the river. Inside, the air was thick with sawdust and the screech of blades cutting through wood. Several men worked at various stations, and she finally spotted Thomas Patrick at the far end, guiding a massive log through a saw with practiced precision. She waited until he finished his cut before approaching. He looked up, clearly surprised to see her, and wiped his hands on his pants. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, and his voice was deeper than she remembered, rough from sawdust and shouting over machinery. "I am here on behalf of Mrs. Dawson's boarding house," Penelope said, holding up her basket. "She sent me to trade eggs for lumber if you have any scraps available." "Martha usually deals with my boss, but I can take you to him," Thomas said, gesturing for her to follow. As they walked through the mill, Penelope noticed the other workers watching them with interest. Thomas seemed oblivious to it, his mind clearly elsewhere. They found his boss, a gruff man named Mr. Garrett, who agreed to the trade and sent Thomas to collect the appropriate boards. Penelope helped him carry them, despite his protests that she should not be doing manual labor in her dress. Up close, she could smell sawdust and sweat on him, but also something else, something warm and masculine that made her pulse quicken in a way it had not since before Robert died. "You are new to town," Thomas said as they loaded the boards into a small cart. It was not quite a question. I arrived 2 days ago, Penelope confirmed. I came to stay with my cousin, but she moved away 6 months ago and I did not know. So I am staying with Mrs. Dawson and helping at the boarding house in exchange for room and reduced board. Thomas nodded, his expression sympathetic. This town is not easy for newcomers, especially for women alone. I imagine it is not easy for anyone, Penelope said softly, meeting his eyes. Especially for widowers with 6 children. He stiffened, surprise flickering across his face. Small town. Everyone knows everyone's business. Mrs. Dawson mentioned it. She seems very concerned about you. Everyone is concerned, but concern does not feed my children or keep a roof over their heads, Thomas said, then immediately looked contrite. I apologize. That was rude. I am just tired. You do not need to apologize, Penelope said. I understand being tired more than you might think. Their eyes met again, and that strange connection sparked between them, a recognition of shared struggle. Thomas opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it and just nodded. Penelope returned to the boarding house with the lumber and could not stop thinking about Thomas Patrick for the rest of the day. There was something about him that called to her, something beyond just sympathy for his situation. He seemed like a good man beaten down by circumstances beyond his control, and she understood that feeling all too well. That night, disaster struck at the Patrick house. Thomas came home to find Lucy in tears, Daniel looking pale and frightened, and Emma screaming at the top of her lungs. The house smelled like smoke. What happened? Thomas demanded, fear shooting through him. There was a fire, Daniel said quickly. Just a small one, I put it out, but Lucy's hand got burned when she tried to move the pot. Lucy held up her left hand, and Thomas's stomach dropped at the sight of the angry red burn covering her palm and 3 fingers. She was crying silently now, biting her lip to keep from making noise, trying to be brave. Get me water and clean cloth, Thomas ordered, and Daniel rushed to obey. Thomas gently took Lucy's hand, and she whimpered at his touch. The burn looked bad, probably 2nd degree at least. She needed a doctor, but the doctor in Fort Bowie charged fees Thomas could not afford. He did what he could, cleaning the burn and wrapping it in cloth soaked in cool water, but Lucy cried herself to sleep that night, and Thomas sat beside her bed feeling like the worst father in the world. He could not do this alone. He could not keep all 6 of them safe and fed and healthy. He was failing, and failure meant his children suffered. The next morning, Lucy's hand looked even worse, swollen and weeping. Thomas knew he had no choice. He had to take her to the doctor and damn the cost. He bundled her up, left Daniel in charge of the others with strict instructions not to cook anything or touch the stove, and carried Lucy to Doc Wilson's office in town. By terrible coincidence, Penelope was passing by when Thomas emerged from the doctor's office an hour later, Lucy holding her newly bandaged hand close to her chest. The doctor had given Thomas a bottle of laudanum for the pain and instructions for keeping the burn clean, along with a bill that had made Thomas's vision blur. Penelope saw the look on his face and the child's bandaged hand and immediately approached. What happened? She asked, genuine concern in her voice. Thomas was so exhausted and overwhelmed that he actually told her, the words spilling out before he could stop them. The fire, the burn, the doctor's bill he could not afford, the fact that he had left 5 children at home unsupervised because he had no other choice. You need help, Penelope said simply, and I need employment. Perhaps we could help each other. Thomas stared at her. What are you suggesting? Hire me to care for your children during the day while you work, Penelope said, the idea forming as she spoke. I can cook and clean and keep them safe. You would not have to worry about them burning down the house or hurting themselves, and I would have a proper job with proper pay. "I cannot afford to pay you," Thomas said bluntly. "I can barely afford to feed my own family." "Then I will work for room and board," Penelope countered. "Mrs. Dawson is kind, but I cannot stay at the boarding house forever on charity. I need a permanent situation. You have children who need care." "It makes sense." Thomas looked at his daughter, then back at Penelope. He saw the desperation in her eyes that matched his own, and he knew she was right. They needed each other. He needed someone to keep his children safe, and she needed somewhere to belong. "All right," he said finally. "But it would not be proper for you to live in my house unchaperoned. People would talk." "Then I will come during the day and return to the boarding house at night," Penelope said. "At least until we can figure out a better arrangement." They shook hands on it, her small hand disappearing into his calloused one, and Penelope felt a jolt run through her at the contact. His hand was warm and strong, and for just a moment, she let herself feel safe. That afternoon, Penelope met all 6 Patrick children, and it was overwhelming. Daniel was serious and quiet, clearly carrying too much responsibility. Lucy was in pain, but trying to be brave. The twins, Samuel and Sarah, were bundles of chaotic energy, talking over each other and fighting about everything. James was clingy and anxious, and little Emma attached herself to Penelope's skirts immediately, starved for female attention. The house was a disaster. Dishes piled in the sink, laundry everywhere, floors that had not been properly swept in months. The children were all too thin, their clothes too small and worn. But the house itself was sturdy, and Penelope could see evidence of Catherine Patrick everywhere. Embroidered samplers on the walls, curtains someone had made with care, a rocking chair by the fireplace worn smooth from use. Penelope rolled up her sleeves and got to work. First, she made a proper meal, using the meager supplies in the kitchen to create a hearty stew that would stretch for days. The children watched her with wide, suspicious eyes at first, but when she served them bowls of hot food and fresh bread, their resistance crumbled. "This is really good," Samuel said around a mouthful, and Sarah nodded agreement. "Thank you," Penelope said, ladling out seconds for both of them. "When did you last have a hot meal?" "Papa made beans last night," James offered. "But he burned them." "Papa burns everything," Emma said matter-of-factly, and despite the sadness of it, Penelope had to suppress a smile. After dinner, she tackled the dishes while Daniel helped dry and put things away. Lucy sat at the table with her injured hand elevated, directing where things went. The twins took James and Emma outside to play, and for the first time in months, the house felt almost peaceful. When Thomas came home that evening, exhausted and covered in sawdust, he stopped in the doorway and just stared. The house was clean. The children were fed and playing quietly. Something that smelled delicious was simmering on the stove. And Penelope was seated at his table mending a shirt with careful stitches, looking like she belonged there. "Papa!" Emma shrieked, launching herself at him, and he caught her automatically, hugging her close. Miss Morrison made stew and bread and cleaned everything and helped Lucy with her hand and made the twins stop fighting, Emma reported in a rush. "Can she stay forever?" Thomas's eyes met Penelope's over his daughter's head, and something passed between them that made Penelope's breath catch. "We will see," Thomas said softly. That night, after Penelope had returned to the boarding house and the children were in bed, Thomas sat in Catherine's rocking chair and let himself feel something he had not felt in 9 months. Hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe with Penelope's help, he could actually keep his family together. The days fell into a rhythm. Penelope arrived each morning just after Thomas left for the mill. She cooked breakfast for the children, got them washed and dressed, taught the younger ones their letters while Daniel helped with chores and Lucy's hand slowly healed. She cooked proper meals, cleaned the house, mended clothes, and gave the children the attention and care they desperately needed. In return, Thomas paid her what little he could spare, and Penelope discovered something she had not expected. She loved those children. She loved Daniel's quiet competence and the way he slowly started to smile again. She loved Lucy's fierce protectiveness of her younger siblings and her creative spirit that emerged once she was not drowning in responsibility. She loved the twins' wild energy once it was channeled into useful tasks. She loved James's sensitive soul and the way he brought her wildflowers. And she loved Emma's unguarded affection, the way the little girl climbed into her lap for stories and called her Miss Penny. And Thomas. She was very carefully not thinking about what she felt for Thomas. He was nothing like Robert had been. Robert had been refined, educated, a merchant's son with soft hands and big plans. Thomas was rough around the edges, a working man with calloused hands and sawdust perpetually in his hair. But he was also kind and patient with his children, hardworking to the point of exhaustion, and when he smiled, which was rare, it transformed his entire face. She found herself watching for him in the evenings, listening for his footsteps on the porch. And when he walked through the door and his face softened at the sight of his clean, fed, happy children, her heart did strange things in her chest. Thomas was having similar thoughts about Penelope that he was trying desperately to ignore. It felt like a betrayal of Catherine to notice how pretty Penelope looked with flour on her nose, or how her laugh made something warm bloom in his chest. Catherine had only been gone 9 months. It was too soon. He should still be in mourning. But his children were thriving in ways they had not since Catherine died, and it was all because of Penelope. Daniel actually acted like a child again instead of a miniature adult. Lucy was drawing pictures and singing while she worked. The twins' fighting had decreased dramatically. James's nightmares had stopped. And Emma had stopped asking for Mama every day, which broke Thomas's heart and relieved it at the same time. 3 weeks after Penelope started working for the Patrick family, trouble arrived in the form of Mrs. Beatrice Thornton, the most prominent gossip in Fort Bowie and self-appointed guardian of public morality. She appeared at the Patrick house one afternoon while Penelope was teaching Emma her letters, her expression pinched with disapproval. "Miss Morrison, I presume," she said, sweeping in without invitation. "I have heard quite a bit about you." "Mrs. Thornton," Penelope said, recognizing her from church. "How can I help you? You can explain why you are living in sin with a widower and his children," Mrs. Thornton said bluntly. "It is completely inappropriate for an unmarried woman to be spending so much time alone with an unmarried man." Penelope felt her face flush with anger. "I am working as a governess and housekeeper, nothing more. I return to Mrs. Dawson's boarding house every evening." "Appearances matter, Miss Morrison. And the appearance is that you have set your cap for Thomas Patrick and are using his children to trap him into marriage. Some of us remember Catherine Patrick and find your behavior disrespectful to her memory." "How dare you?" Penelope said, her voice shaking. "These children were neglected and half-starved when I arrived. Mr. Patrick is a good man doing his best in impossible circumstances. I am helping because they need help, not because I have some scheme." "Then you are doing this out of the goodness of your heart," Mrs. Thornton said skeptically. "How very convenient that your charity serves your interests so well." Before Penelope could respond, the door opened and Thomas walked in early from work. He took in the scene immediately, his jaw tightening. "Mrs. Thornton," he said coldly, "to what do I owe this intrusion?" "I am concerned about propriety, Mr. Patrick," she said. "Having this woman in your home unsupervised is creating talk." "Then people should find something better to do with their time," Thomas said. "Miss Morrison has been a blessing to my family." Without her help, I would likely have lost my children to an orphanage by now because I could not care for them properly. If you are so concerned about propriety, where were you and your charitable friends when Lucy burned her hand? When my children were going hungry? Where was all this concern then? Mrs. Thornton drew herself up indignantly. We brought meals for weeks after Catherine died. For 6 weeks. Then everyone went back to their comfortable lives and forgot about us. Miss Morrison has not forgotten. She has been here every day for nearly a month, and my children are healthy and happy for the first time since their mother died. So I suggest you take your concern about propriety and direct it toward something actually useful. He held the door open pointedly, and Mrs. Thornton left in a huff. But as the door closed behind her, Thomas and Penelope looked at each other with worried eyes. "She will make trouble," Penelope said quietly. "Let her try," Thomas said. But they both knew it was not that simple. The talk started almost immediately. Women whispered when Penelope walked down the street. Men gave Thomas knowing looks at the mill. Even Martha Dawson, kind as she was, gently suggested that perhaps Penelope should look for other employment before her reputation was completely ruined. "If people think you are living as his mistress, no respectable family will ever hire you," Martha said. "And if you leave Fort Bowie, your reputation will not follow you. You could start fresh somewhere else." But Penelope could not imagine leaving. The children needed her. And if she was honest with herself, she needed them too. For the first time since Robert died, she had purpose and a place where she belonged. That night, Thomas walked Penelope back to the boarding house as he had started doing once the gossip began. It was full dark, the stars brilliant overhead and their footsteps echoed in the quiet street. "I am sorry," Thomas said abruptly. "I have ruined your reputation by being selfish. I should have thought about how this would look." "You needed help with your children," Penelope said firmly. "That is not selfish, it is practical. Maybe, but now you are paying the price for my needs." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Martha is right. You should leave before this gets worse. Go somewhere you can have a fresh start." "I do not want to leave," Penelope said, and her voice came out more passionate than she intended. "Those children need me. They are finally happy and healthy and safe." "And what about what you need?" Thomas asked softly. "You deserve more than being a governess in a house where you are not even welcome to stay overnight. You deserve a real home and a real life." "I had a real life once," Penelope said, tears suddenly hot in her eyes. "I had a husband and a home and plans for the future. Then he died and I lost everything. Those children, this work, it is the first time since Robert died that I have felt like I have something to live for. Do not take that away from me because small-minded people cannot understand." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and in the moonlight his eyes were very dark. "What if there was a way you could stay and the gossip would stop?" "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath. "What if we got married?" Penelope's heart stopped. "What?" "A marriage of convenience," Thomas said quickly. "For propriety and practicality, you would have a home and security. The children would have a mother. The gossip would stop. We could help each other." "That is not a reason to get married," Penelope whispered. "People have married for worse reasons," Thomas countered. "We get along well. You love the children and they love you. We are both alone and struggling. Why not help each other?" "Because I want more than that," Penelope thought. "Because I want to be married to someone who loves me, not someone who just needs a governess and housekeeper he does not have to pay." But what she said was, "I need to think about it." Thomas nodded, looking relieved that she had not said no outright. "Of course. Take all the time you need." That night Penelope could not sleep. Marriage, to Thomas Patrick, it was absurd, it was practical, it was terrifying. She had married for love once and losing Robert had nearly destroyed her. Could she really marry without love, marry for convenience and survival? But she thought about the children, about Emma's trusting hand in hers, about Lucy's shy smile when she showed Penelope her drawings, about the twins' exuberant hugs, about James's quiet questions about his mother, about Daniel's gradual transformation from a burdened adult back into a boy. She thought about Thomas, too, about the way he looked at his children with such fierce love, about how hard he worked to provide for them, about the gentleness in his big, rough hands when he helped Emma with her shoes or checked Lucy's healing burn, about the way her heart beat faster when he walked into a room. She was halfway in love with him already, she realized. Maybe that made marrying him incredibly foolish, or maybe it made it the only sensible choice. In the morning, she told him yes. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Fort Bowie, with Martha Dawson and Thomas's boss, Mr. Garrett, standing as witnesses, and all 6 children present in their best clothes that Penelope had mended and cleaned until they looked almost new. Penelope wore a simple blue dress, also mended from one of Catherine's old gowns that Lucy had shyly offered her. "Mama would want someone to wear it," Lucy had said, "and she would have liked you." The ceremony was brief and businesslike. The preacher seemed vaguely disapproving of the hasty marriage but performed the service nonetheless. Thomas slipped a plain gold band on Penelope's finger, and when the preacher said he could kiss his bride, Thomas pressed a chaste, careful kiss to her lips that was over almost before it began. Then they were married, and Penelope was Mrs. Thomas Patrick, stepmother to 6 children and wife to a man who needed her but did not love her. The gossip did not stop entirely, but it changed. Now, instead of speculation about sin and scandal, it was judgment about Penelope replacing Catherine so quickly and speculation about whether Thomas had been carrying on with her before the marriage. But Penelope held her head high and ignored it as best she could. Moving into the Patrick house permanently was strange. She took over the small bedroom that had been used for storage, and Thomas remained in what had been his and Catherine's room. They were scrupulously polite with each other, careful not to touch more than necessary, formal in a way that made Penelope's heart ache. At night, lying in her narrow bed, Penelope could hear Thomas moving around in his room through the thin walls and wondered what he was thinking. Did he regret the marriage? Did he miss Catherine so much that having Penelope in the house was painful? Did he feel anything at all for her beyond gratitude for childcare? The children, at least, were thrilled with the arrangement. Emma started calling Penelope Mama within a week, which made Penelope cry the first time and made Thomas look like he might cry too. The other children were more reserved, but gradually they warmed to the permanence of the situation. Lucy started asking Penelope questions about being a woman. The twins brought their problems to her instead of fighting. James sought comfort from her when he was scared. Even Daniel, so careful with his trust, started to open up. Weeks passed, then a month. Summer's brutal heat gave way to the more bearable warmth of early fall. The mill had a busy period, and Thomas worked longer hours. Penelope fell into the rhythms of running a household, of managing 6 children and a home and a husband who was scrupulously polite but emotionally distant. She was lonely, she realized. Surrounded by people and desperately lonely, because the one person she wanted to be close to kept himself carefully distant. Things came to a head on a cool October evening. Thomas came home to find dinner ready as usual, the children clean and fed as usual, the house tidy as usual. But Penelope was not her usual calm self. She was quiet through dinner, and when the children went to bed, she started washing dishes with short, sharp movements that spoke of suppressed emotion. "Did something happen today?" Thomas asked carefully. "Are the children all right?" "The children are fine," Penelope said, scrubbing a pot viciously. They are always fine, I make sure of that. Then what is wrong? Nothing is wrong. Everything is exactly as it should be. You needed a housekeeper and governess. I needed a home. The arrangement works perfectly. Thomas heard the brittleness in her voice and felt his stomach drop. Penelope. I met someone in town today, she continued, still not looking at him. Mrs. Henderson. She was very kind, very concerned. She wanted to know how I was managing with 6 children who were not my own. Whether it was difficult to live in another woman's house and raise another woman's children. Whether you ever talked about your first wife and how I compared to her. What did you tell her? Thomas asked quietly. I told her I loved the children as if they were my own, which is true. Penelope finally turned to face him, and there were tears on her cheeks. I did not tell her that I am invisible to you unless I am performing some function, that we have been married for 6 weeks, and I know nothing about you beyond what you need for dinner and whether you need shirts mended. That I am so lonely in this house full of people that some nights I can barely breathe. Thomas felt like he had been punched. I did not realize. Of course you did not realize. You are so busy being scrupulously polite and respectful and distant that you have not actually looked at me once since we got married. She wiped angrily at her tears. I know this was a practical arrangement. I know you married me because you needed help, not because you wanted a wife. But I am a person, Thomas. I have feelings and thoughts, and I exist when I am not cooking your dinner or watching your children. You think I do not see you, Thomas said, and something broke in his careful control. I see you all the time. I see you every morning when I leave for work, and you are already in the kitchen making breakfast. I see you every evening when I come home, and you have transformed chaos into order. I see how my children look at you, how they have blossomed under your care. I see how kind you are, how patient, how strong. Then why do you act like I am a piece of furniture? Penelope demanded. Because I am terrified. Thomas shouted and then looked shocked at his own volume. The children were sleeping. He lowered his voice, but the intensity remained. I am terrified because I am starting to feel things for you that I have no right to feel. We agreed this was a practical arrangement. You married me for security, not for love. I did not want to make you uncomfortable by developing feelings you do not share. Penelope stared at him. You think I do not have feelings for you. You loved your first husband, Thomas said. I have seen how you look when you talk about him. I am nothing like him. I am just a mill worker with too many children and too much baggage. You are right. You are nothing like Robert, Penelope said, stepping closer to him. Robert was refined and educated, and he never got sawdust in his hair, but he has been dead for over a year, and I mourned him, and now he is a memory. You are real. You are here. And yes, you are a mill worker with 6 children, but you are also kind and hardworking, and you love those children with your whole heart. Do you really think I could live in this house for 2 months and not fall in love with that? Thomas's breath caught. What did you say? I said I am falling in love with you, Penelope said, her voice shaking. Which is probably the stupidest thing I could have done because you are still in love with Catherine, and I will always be second best, but I cannot help how I feel. You are not second best, Thomas said roughly. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides and cupped her face in his hands. Catherine was my wife, and I loved her, and I will always carry her memory. But she is gone. You are here. And what I feel for you is not some pale shadow of what I felt for her. It is different and new and terrifying, and I think about you constantly. Really? Penelope whispered. Really, Thomas said, and then he kissed her. This kiss was nothing like the chaste peck at their wedding. This kiss was deep and hungry and full of weeks of suppressed longing. Penelope's hands clutched at his shirt, and Thomas pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair. They kissed until they were both breathless, until the distance and politeness that had defined their marriage dissolved completely. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I want this to be a real marriage," he said quietly. "Not just an arrangement, a real partnership. Is that what you want too?" "Yes," Penelope said, and kissed him again to prove it. That night, the wall between their bedrooms might as well have not existed anymore. They talked until late, really talked, sharing stories and fears and hopes. Thomas told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, about falling in love with Catherine and moving west for opportunity, about the joy of each child being born, and the devastation of losing Catherine. Penelope told him about her childhood as a merchant's daughter, about falling in love with Robert, about the cholera epidemic that killed him and destroyed everything she knew, about the fear and loneliness of being completely alone. "You are not alone anymore," Thomas said, holding her hand in the darkness. "Neither of us is alone anymore." The change in their marriage was immediately apparent to everyone. Thomas started coming home for lunch when he could, stealing kisses in the kitchen while the children giggled. Penelope stopped sleeping in the small bedroom and moved into Thomas's room, into the bed that had been Catherine's but was now theirs. They talked and laughed and fell more deeply in love with each passing day. The children thrived in the warmth of their parents' happiness. Even Daniel, who had been the most reserved about accepting Penelope, started to call her Ma in unguarded moments. Lucy confided her dreams and secrets. The twins brought them endless entertainment with their antics. James's anxiety faded. And Emma, who had started it all by calling Penelope Mama, basked in the attention of two parents who were obviously in love. By Christmas of 1878, the Patrick household was transformed. Thomas had gotten a raise at the mill, and while money was still tight, it was not the desperate struggle it had been. The house was warm and full of laughter. On Christmas morning, Penelope and Thomas gave the children small gifts they had made or saved for, and the joy on 6 faces made every sacrifice worth it. That night, after the children were finally asleep, Thomas pulled Penelope into his arms by the fireplace. "I have something for you," he said, and handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a chain. Penelope opened it and found a tiny photograph of all 6 children inside. "I wanted you to have something to remind you that you are their mother now," Thomas said. "Not just in name, but in truth. They love you, Penelope, and so do I, more than I ever thought I could love anyone again." Tears spilled down Penelope's cheeks. "I love you too, all of you. This family is everything to me." "You saved us," Thomas said softly. "When you stepped off that stagecoach, I was drowning. My children were suffering. I had nothing left to give. And then you were just there like an answer to prayers I did not even know how to pray. You saved all of us." "You saved me too," Penelope whispered. "I had nothing and no one. I was so lost. And then you and the children gave me a reason to keep going, a place to belong. We saved each other." They made love that night with a tenderness and passion that spoke of deep love, not just need. And afterward, lying in the darkness with Thomas's arms around her, Penelope thought about how far she had come from that desperate woman in mourning clothes, stepping off a stagecoach into an unknown future. The months passed in a blur of happiness. Spring came to Arizona, bringing wildflowers to the harsh landscape. The children grew like weeds. Daniel started working part-time at the mill alongside his father, earning his own money and gaining confidence. Lucy discovered a talent for sewing and started making beautiful clothes. The twins calmed down slightly, channeling their energy into useful work around the house and property. James started school and loved learning. Emma followed Penelope everywhere, chattering constantly and bringing light to every room. In early summer of 1879, Penelope realized she had missed her monthly courses. Then she missed them again. By the third month, there was no denying it. She was pregnant. She told Thomas on a warm June evening while they sat on the porch watching the children play in the yard. He had just come home from work, tired but content, and she had poured him a glass of water and sat beside him in the companionable silence they had grown to cherish. "I have something to tell you," she said, her heart pounding. Thomas looked at her, immediately alert to the nervousness in her voice. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," Penelope said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Thomas just stared at her, his hand warm through the fabric of her dress. Then his face transformed with joy so pure it took her breath away. "A baby," he said. "Our baby." "Our baby," Penelope confirmed, and found herself laughing as Thomas pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I love you," he said fiercely. "I love you so much." The children were ecstatic when they told them. Even Daniel, nearly 13 and too old for such displays, grinned widely. Lucy immediately started planning what the baby would need. The twins argued about whether it would be a boy or a girl. James wanted to know when it would arrive. And Emma announced that she was going to be the best big sister ever. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Thomas was excessively protective, trying to keep Penelope from any work that might be too strenuous. She tolerated it with good humor, understanding that his worry came from losing Catherine in childbirth. But she was young and healthy, and Doc Wilson assured them both that everything looked perfectly normal. In late January of 1880, on a cold, clear night, Penelope went into labor. Thomas sent Daniel running for the doctor and Martha Dawson, then paced the house like a caged animal while Lucy tried to help, and the younger children were shuttled to a neighbor's house. "I am fine," Penelope kept assuring him between contractions. "Women have babies every day, Thomas." "Catherine said the same thing," Thomas said, his face pale. "And then she died." Penelope reached for his hand. "I am not Catherine, and I am not dying. I am bringing our child into the world, and I need you to be strong for me." Thomas gripped her hand like a lifeline and did not leave her side through the long hours of labor. When the baby finally arrived just after dawn, a healthy boy with a full head of dark hair and strong lungs, Thomas wept with relief and joy. "He is perfect," Penelope said, exhausted but glowing as she held their son. "He is absolutely perfect." They named him Jacob Thomas Patrick, and he was welcomed into the family with enthusiasm by 6 older siblings who fought over who got to hold him and help with his care. Thomas could not stop looking at his wife and new son with wonder, marveling at how much his life had changed in less than 2 years. Jacob thrived, growing fat and happy under the care of his mother and 6 doting siblings. Penelope recovered quickly from the birth and fell back into the rhythms of running a household that now included 7 children. It should have been overwhelming, but with Daniel's help and Lucy's competence, and even the twins' willingness to pitch in, it was manageable, more than manageable. It was joy. By the summer of 1880, Thomas had been promoted to foreman at the mill, a position that came with better pay and respect. The Patrick family was no longer on the edge of survival. They were comfortable, even able to save a little money. Thomas bought Penelope a new dress, the first new dress she had owned since before Robert died, and she wore it to church on Sunday with pride. The gossip about their marriage had long since died down. Even Mrs. Beatrice Thornton had been forced to admit that the Patrick family was thriving and that Penelope was a model wife and mother. The children were well behaved and well cared for. The house was always clean. Thomas never missed work and never came home drunk. It was, by all accounts, a successful marriage, but it was more than successful. It was happy. On their second wedding anniversary, Thomas closed the mill early and took Penelope on a picnic, just the two of them, while Martha Dawson agreed to watch all 7 children. They rode out to a spot by the river where cottonwood trees provided shade, and the sound of running water drowned out the rest of the world. "I have been thinking about something," Thomas said as they sat on a blanket eating the lunch Penelope had packed. "Do you remember what you said the day we met? That you had nothing left?" "I remember," Penelope said. "It was true, I had nothing." "You were wrong," Thomas said, taking her hand. "You had yourself, your strength, your kindness, your capability. You had everything that mattered, even if you could not see it then. And you gave all of that to me and my children when we needed it most." "You gave me just as much," Penelope said. "You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You gave me love when I thought I would never feel it again." Thomas pulled her close, kissing her softly. "We gave each other everything," he said. "That is what marriage should be, partnership and love and choosing each other every day." "I choose you," Penelope said. "Every day for the rest of my life I choose you." "And I choose you," Thomas replied. They made love under the cottonwood trees, sweet and slow, and afterward lay tangled together talking about their dreams for the future. Maybe expanding the house to give the children more room. Maybe saving enough money to send Daniel to school if he wanted to learn a trade beyond mill work. Maybe having more children if that was what happened. Maybe just continuing to build the life they had created together, day by day, year by year. The years did pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Daniel grew into a fine young man and eventually took over as foreman when Thomas became part owner of the mill. Lucy married a young soldier from the fort and gave Thomas and Penelope their first grandchild. The twins, inseparable as always, both became carpenters and built a reputation for quality work. James became a teacher, fulfilling Penelope's secret dream of education and learning. Emma grew into a beautiful young woman with her father's determination and her mother's kind heart. Jacob was joined by 2 more siblings, a daughter named Catherine Rose and another son named William, and the Patrick house rang with the sounds of children for years. Through it all, Thomas and Penelope were the center, the foundation that held everything together. They weathered storms and celebrated triumphs. They argued and made up. They faced illness and hardship and joy and success. And through all of it, they loved each other with a depth and constancy that only grew stronger with time. On a cool October evening in 1895, Thomas and Penelope sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of gold and crimson. They were in their 50s now, their hair showing gray, their faces lined with years of laughter and tears. But they held hands like young lovers, fingers intertwined in a grip that spoke of decades of partnership. "You ever think about that day?" Penelope asked. "When I stepped off the stagecoach and you were standing there with flour on your shirt?" "All the time," Thomas admitted. "I think about how desperate I was, how close I came to losing everything. And then you appeared, like a miracle I did not deserve." "We both needed a miracle," Penelope said. "We both needed each other so desperately. I am glad we were brave enough to reach for it." "Best decision I ever made," Thomas said, bringing her hand to his lips. "Asking you to marry me." "Best decision I ever made saying yes," Penelope replied. Inside the house, they could hear their children and grandchildren. Daniel and his wife were visiting with their 3 children. Lucy had brought her family down from the fort. The twins had stopped by after work. James was reading to his younger siblings. The house was full of noise and life and love, built on the foundation of 2 people who had needed each other desperately, and had been brave enough to build something beautiful from that need. Thomas pulled Penelope closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, watching the sun sink below the horizon. Somewhere in town, another stagecoach was probably arriving, bringing new people with their own stories of loss and hope. Somewhere, someone was drowning in desperation, wondering how they would survive another day. Somewhere, two people who needed each other were about to meet. But here, on this porch, in this house full of love and laughter and family, two people who had once had nothing had found everything. Thomas kissed the top of Penelope's head, breathing in the scent of her hair that after 17 years was as familiar as his own heartbeat. She squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, a silent conversation they had perfected over years of marriage. "I love you," he said, as he did every day. "I love you too," she replied, as she always had and always would. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Fort Bowie, Arizona, the Patrick family gathered for dinner, multiple generations around a table that had seen countless meals and celebrations and ordinary days that were extraordinary simply because they were together. Thomas looked around at the faces of his children and grandchildren, at his wife's serene smile, at the abundance that filled his home, and felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful. From desperation and despair, from two people who had nothing left and needed each other desperately, had grown this love and family and a legacy that would continue long after he and Penelope were gone. That night, lying in bed with Penelope curled against his side, Thomas thought about the long journey that had brought them here. The pain of losing Catherine, the struggle to keep his children fed and safe. The moment when he had looked across the street and seen a young widow in black stepping off a stagecoach, lost and alone. "What are you thinking about?" Penelope murmured sleepily. "Destiny," Thomas said. "Whether we were always meant to find each other, or whether we just got very, very lucky." "Does it matter?" Penelope asked. "We found each other. We built this life together. That is what matters." She was right, as she so often was. It did not matter whether it was destiny or chance or divine intervention. What mattered was that when they had both been drowning, they had reached for each other and pulled each other to safety. What mattered was that they had chosen each other, every day, through good times and bad, through poverty and prosperity, through loss and gain. What mattered was love. As Thomas drifted off to sleep with his wife in his arms and his children safe under his roof, he sent up a silent prayer of thanksgiving. For second chances, for unexpected blessings, for the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 17 years ago and changed his entire world. For Penelope, who had saved him and his children when they needed her desperately, and who had let him save her in return. For the family they had built together from the ashes of their separate losses, for the life they had created, day by day, choice by choice, for 17 years and counting. For love that had started in desperation and grown into something stronger than either of them could have imagined. And as he fell asleep, Thomas smiled, knowing that when he woke in the morning, Penelope would be there, that his children would fill the house with noise and energy, that another day of their life together was waiting, ordinary and precious, and everything he had ever needed. The Wild West was not an easy place to live. Fort Bowie, Arizona, in the late 1800s was harsh and unforgiving, a place where people struggled to survive and had to be tough to endure. But it was also a place where two people who had nothing left could find each other and build something beautiful, where a man with 6 children he could not manage alone could meet a woman who had lost everything, where desperate need could become deep love, where endings could become new beginnings, and where a family could grow and thrive and love for generations, All because two broken people had been brave enough to reach for each other when they needed it most. That was the legacy of Thomas and Penelope Patrick. Not wealth or fame or status, but love. Simple, profound, enduring love that had saved two lives and created many more. And in the end, that was everything that mattered.